What do students living in poverty, especially students of color, need from their schools? The answer, I think, in research, reinforced by myself for decades of work in New York City public schools with many of these students, is simple. Delivering it is much more difficult. What they need are fundamentally two things. They need a place of peace, stability, safety, and caring that they can go to every day. For children who are homeless, for example, which we often think of as an extremity of impoverishment, but for which 1 in every 8 children in New York City public schools are. And New York City is far from the city in this country with the greatest intensity of poverty. It may mean something as simple as a place where they know they can get 2 meals every day when their family is struggling to feed them. It's a place where they know that they can come in when they may not know where they're going to sleep that night, but they can come in every day, and that will be a place that will be there, an anchor in their lives. It's a place where they know they can come every day and have adults who care deeply about them and about their own educational process. Secondly, it needs to be a place of active, engaged learning. Research is quite unequivocal on these 2 counts. We know that students who are impoverished, particularly students of color, respond most positively to educators who indicate a deep caring about what is happening in their life and what is happening with their achievement, that's especially important for them. And research shows that for students who don't have all the resources and opportunities for educational advancement that middle class and upper class students do, it is particularly important to have a learning process which is active and which is engaged. And so I want to talk today mostly about the pedagogy of no excuses schools, which I think is not a generally deeply looked at topic. I'm going to do that by starting, because I want to be as fair as I can in this exercise, with Doug Lemav's book, Teach Like a Champion. Doug Lemav comes out of the Uncommon Schools in New York City. And this book is a book which is widely used, greatly respected in no excuse charter school operations like HIP, Achievement First, and Uncommon Schools. And it is indeed very much at the center, for those of you who follow these things, the attempt to create a school of education for charter school teachers, Relay School of Education in New York City. Doug Lemav begins his book, as he tells us he begins his teacher trainings, quote, by showing a video clip of my colleague Doug McCurry, the founder of Amistad Academy in New Haven, Connecticut, and the Achievement First network of schools. In the clip, McCurry teaches his students how to pass out papers on the first day or 2 of school. He takes a minute or so to explain the right way to do it, pass across rows, start on his command, only the person passing gets out of his or her seat if required, and so on. Then his students start to practice. McCurry times them with a stopwatch. 10 seconds, pretty good. Let's see if we can get back in 8. The students, by the way, are happy as can be. They love to be challenged and love to see themselves improving. Now, I want to stress that I'm not cherry picking this particular technique. It's one that he begins his book with. And he says, when I do this, there are skeptics, but I still think it's important to start with this. And he says, I ask you to consider the objections to this in light of the following. Assume that the average class of students passes out or back papers and materials 20 times a day, and that it takes a typical class a minute and 20 seconds to do this. If McCurry students can accomplish this task in just 20 seconds, they will save 20 minutes a day. Assuming all told, McCurry spends an hour teaching and practicing this routine. His short investment will yield a return in learning time of roughly 6,000% over the course of the year, setting his students free to engage their minds. I think for those of us like myself who are historians of the labor process and of work in the United States, this particular example is very reminiscent to us of the work of Frederick Winslow Taylor, who was an early 20th century sociologist qua industrialist who did very detailed time motion studies of workers in their labor process. The idea was to break down the labor process into discrete actions which could be repeated over and over again without any thought. This is the assembly line in its most extreme sort of form. And this became to be known, for those of you who follow this history, by the name Taylorism, a very important development in the lives of working people and labor. I think what Lemav's example and Taylorism share in common is this focus on the quantity of time. That time is this important, very scarce resource, and it's important to increase that time. And so for Taylor, it was important as much as possible to have workers working, producing the product and not spending time doing irrelevant things like talking to each other. What's missing from it, I think, and this is particularly true in Lemav, is a focus on the quality of the time that is actually spent. It's instructive, I think, to look at schools in terms of intentionality and what exactly is intended in producing a particular school culture. And for the no excuses schools in the vein of Lemav, learning is a question of discipline, much more than it is a question of student engagement. Lemav talks about a technique which exists in all of these schools. It goes by different names in some schools, but he identifies it as Slant. And so students are trained, Slant is an acronym for what students are trained to do. It is sit up, listen, ask and answer questions, nod your head, and track the speaker. All those come out to Slant. And over the course, if you visited schools, and I've visited a KIPP school, I've visited an Achievement First school, I've visited Uncommon School, what you will see is if a teacher thinks that a student or a group of students is not paying attention, they will reference Slant. It's time, are you tracking me with your eyes? Are you? I think what's interesting here is that the key to learning in this intentional activity is to training students to engage in physical activities, sitting up, watching, tracking. Contrast it with the habits of mind that one finds in Deborah Meyer's Central Park East schools, which is an entirely different set of intentionality. Here, in every episode of learning, students are asked, how do you know what you know? From whose viewpoint is it being presented? How is the event or the work connected to other events or work? What if things were different? Why is this important? The intentionality there is a focus on intellectually challenging and engaging students. So what is problematic in Teaching Like a Champion, I want to talk about two things in particular. Teaching is reduced to a series of techniques without a focus on the ends and the purpose of education. A philosopher would call this a prime example of instrumental rationality, where we look at the means divorced from the ends, the kind of making the trains run on time is a classical example of instrumental rationality. Now, many of these techniques are unobjectionable as tools, but some of them are inappropriate. If the goal of education is to engage students in critical thinking, problem solving, analytical thinking, persuasive, logical, oral, and written examples. For example, Lemave makes a big point in his book about the use of group answers, where all of the students in a class respond in unison. That is not a thinking exercise. He talks about teaching multiplication and using chanting of multiplication tables for students to remember. But the thing that's important to understand about memorizing multiplication tables is that if you don't use them, you forget them. I went to Catholic school, and I had a nun in the 4th grade who thought that we had to have memorized every multiplication table before we actually did any multiplication. And so by the time we were finished with the 12 multiplication tables, I had forgotten the first 6. Learning is something that we do when we use information, when we're active in the process. It's not something that comes from rote memorization. In the one chapter in the book where he talks about what he says are thought questions, where he talks about engaging students in lessons, there is no discussion of thought questions there or anywhere else in the book, but simply on calling students who don't volunteer in the course of the class. An important thing to do, certainly, but not the fundamental thing if you're trying to get your students intellectually engaged. Teaching and learning on a daily basis needs to be connected to the needs of it, to the ends of education. How does what is being taught relate to building the capacity of students to be democratic citizens in 21st century America, in preparing them to be forces for progress and agents of change in their own community, in guiding them as they struggle to create for themselves lives of meaning and purpose? What happens when the ends of education are not intentional and explicit and are not connected to everyday teaching and learning is that other things come to stand in their stead. Today, more than ever, it is the standardized test. The test becomes the only significant measure of student learning, whether or not it has any real relationship to the ends of education that we think we should have in a democratic society. Class activity becomes focused on increasing test scores. The second point, for Lemave, the teacher is the active force in learning, and students are largely passive recipients of their own learning. Think of the title of the book. Teacher is champion. Teacher is the star. Teacher is the center of the stage. But what's important, I would submit, is a much harder, more difficult, but more important conception of teaching. One in which the classroom is student-centered, not teacher-centered, and the teacher plays the vital role of catalyst, of coach, guiding students in their learning, not telling them what to think, but enlightening them into the process of thinking so that they learn to think for themselves. It's much harder teaching to do, precisely because students living in poverty do not have access to many of the resources and opportunities that middle class and upper class students have in terms of education. Active and engaged learning is especially important for them. There is clear research literature that points to this. Cultural competence of teachers is simply teachers understanding their students and their lives so that they can build caring relationships with those students and they can engage those students intellectually. The notion that somehow poor kids of color can't have the intellectually engaging and exciting and empowering education that we assume as a norm for many other students is precisely what needs to be challenged here.